I want to keep going.
For all of you who won't be somewhere to see, I don't know why.
It was just random, I think. All right, let's get started. My name is Matthew Hodgson, and I'm a partner and senior executive at ZenX Machina. My area of responsibility is Agile and UX. And today I'm going to be talking to you about transformations. Hands up if you remember your very first transformation from the old way you did things to Agile. For how many of you was it a bit of a disaster? The Chaos Report tells us that about 15% roughly of Agile projects, unlike about 30 for Waterfall, fail. Some of them, like dear old Bruce Banner, they spend a lifetime trying to fix and repair. For a lot of organisations, this means that they simply go, well, we tried it, it didn't work, so let's not do it anymore. Let's go back to our old ways, even though that those might have been broken as well. How many of you, though, actually know the reason why, as you practice now, why the things that you do are successful? One person. All right, that's two of us. Anyone remember this movie? The first Avenger, Captain America? They wanted to build a super soldier. So they did this thing, they pumped him full of all this stuff, zapped him with lots of rays, and he became Captain America. Biggest problem is they weren't able to replicate it. Perfect success, didn't know how to do it again. The old Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde book. Beautiful story. But did you know that Dr. Jekyll actually had to take his potion quite a number of times before he was able to just transform by himself? I think about my last Scrum project. I was the Scrum coach, and it was a great success. Some people say it was because I like to bring chocolate to all my ceremonies. And when you're doing sprint planning, it goes for a couple of hours. Chocolate's important. The particular environment that the project was set in might not be unusual to some of you. The project had been going for quite a while, was getting to a point, was running out of time and money, and I'd had a discussion with the project manager about 12 months earlier about Agile methods, Scrum in particular. And he said, well, look, in order to get this thing over the line, we need to do something different. And Scrum had the potential to be able to provide that sort of benefit. If I compare that to one of my very first projects, that one didn't go so well. But the project environment was almost exactly the same. It had been going for a while. They were concerned that they'd never deliver anything. They were just spinning in the analysis design sort of phase. Wanted to get something over the line, but just didn't know how. My question that I've been thinking about quite a lot, probably particularly over this last 12 months as I've been doing this last project, is why? Why, in particular, was this particular Scrum coaching engagement that I was doing, why was it successful? What were the factors around it that made it successful? Most importantly, so I could replicate it, and so I could tell you guys. What was it about the formula that I was using? Well, I have a psych background, and a lot of the time when I think about these things, I go back to human behaviour. Try to understand the things that people did that worked and the behaviours that actually stopped the success of other projects. Any of you this strike a chord? Planning is a waste of time for the developers. They should be coding, not planning. Or why have you got a developer with a designer here? What do they do? I'm not going to pay for two people to do the same thing. Or this one? One of my earliest Scrum coaching projects, we got together, we're doing some planning and talking about, relating who's who. Subject matter expert was sitting there and saying, well, yes, we're talking about this is a trusted environment. Well, you need to trust that I have the solution. Now, let's know this environment. This guy had already gone away and basically designed for himself exactly what he thought the solution would be. And he, in this environment, was very used to basically going up to developer on project and saying, okay, do it like this, do it like this. Strangely enough, I had exactly one of these on my last project as well. To be fair, it's not really their fault. And it's something that we need to understand. You shouldn't blame these people for these behaviours. Importantly, it's not about the culture. These are not cultural things. A lot of people say, well, you need a special environment. The culture has to be accepting of these things. But culture is the output of behaviour. Culture is, in an organisation, is just like your personality. It's hard to change. It takes a very long time to instigate change. Your behaviour, though, is actually much easier to change. And in a Scrum environment, I found that it's mostly to do with the group dynamics. And the solution lies in understanding, therefore, and changing the behaviour that's stopping success or impedes success. And if you're familiar with this guy, Tuckman, 1965, one of my most favourite pieces of organisational and group dynamic psychology. He says that there are four phases that groups go through when you get a new group together: forming, storming, norming, and performing. In the forming stage, your behaviour is driven by the desire to be accepted. But once you hit the storming phase, you've got all these ideas that are competing and challenging each other. So that by the time you get to norming, those ideas that were formed in the storming phase are now the accepted way that everyone should behave. The absence of any frame of reference will ensure people will behave based on the overarching context. If you don't set the context up front, something I found most important in my last project, if you fail to set the requirements for behaviour up front, people will simply behave based on what they're used to behaving. Particularly in this part. For any new project, even if it's transferred from Waterfall to Agile, an Agile method, or if it's just doing a new project, this particular part is the most difficult bit to get through, because this is where managers and people who have power based on the organisational structure will enforce their ideas and say, well, I'm responsible for this project, I'm not going to pay for 2 people. This is coercive power, the threat of taking away budget because this is my idea that I want to reinforce. French and Raven was the guy that came up with these 5 phrases: coercive power, legitimate power, reward power, expert power, and referent power. Any ideas which are the 2 that are important for Scrum and most Agile environments? Expert power and referent power. Agile Manifesto says that we should be relying on collaboration. This is one of the key things. These, coercive power, legitimate power in particular, and reward power, are power structures that are reinforced by hierarchy. The manager was imperfectly within his right, based on the organisational dynamic, to come in and say, it's my project, this is how I want to do things. So the critical part is to break these things. How do we do that? Governance is the single most important way to break these legitimate power behaviours that will impact on your need to reinforce referent power and expert power. Collaborative power, if you like. Prince 2, some Agilists hate Prince 2. I've come to love it. Love and hate at the same time. But this sets the expectation around behaviour for your project. A lot of people, in fact, I was speaking at Agile Australia a couple of months ago, and it seems that Sprint 0 has got this really dirty word. It's just like, oh no, Sprint 0 is bad. But what I've come to find is that Sprint 0 for me is just about project initiation. If I'm going to transfer a project from Waterfall to Agile, I re-norm the environment by doing a brand new project initiation phase. I do a Sprint 0. And I set it up. And I said, well, you're a Prince 2 environment, and there's a PMI equivalent. You normally have governance frameworks. Well, this is the one that we're going to use. And I superimpose Scrum roles directly into that framework. So, well, normally you're the product owner. Well, you're the project owner. You're the business guy. You're responsible for this project. Well, these are the areas in which you will be involved based on a standard that they've already accepted. key, and a lot of organisations don't use this particular method, but it's an important one. RACI VS. VS is sort of optional, but I find it useful. RACI just stands for responsible, accountable, collaborate, inform, verify, and sign off. Responsible, that's the guy who goes to jail if things go bad. Accountable are the guys who actually do the work, the pigs. Who should you be collaborating with? Who should you just be informing? And if you use the VS, who is going to verify that everything is okay, particularly in the stage boundary before you deploy? Some scrums are a bit flaccid. It's called flaccid scrum. They get to the end and they haven't actually got anything to deliver. Within a stage boundary, you want to be able to, I know flaccid scrum, it's a bit of a bizarre phrase. You want to be able to have potentially deliverable things. And your stage gateways within Prince to say, well, all right, well, we'll accumulate all of this stuff, and someone else is therefore responsible for verifying that everything's okay, and the project board then to sign it off, to sign off the actual deployment. And this is essentially what it looks like. So that with the product owner, his responsibility is to inform the project board. The project board is responsible for the outcomes overall and has to sign off on deployment. The product owner collaborates with the team. And importantly, any SMEs, your project stakeholders and users, yes, they verify the acceptance criteria is being met during sprint review, during the demo. I always invite them along so they can see what was promised is actually being delivered, as well as them informing the team of their needs and of what they value. Essentially, for my new project, it's meant that the normative behaviours, all the roles and responsibilities were clear up front, and there was a clear path for the subject matter experts to come in and say, well, this is what I value, this is what I need, here are my requirements, all about the what, without getting into the how, without solutioneering.
So just on normative, in other words, behaviours that people should display.
Yes, and in fact when the project is going, the behaviours that are encouraged and reinforced. These are the normative behaviours are the standard behaviours that everyone will do given a specific context. Without a context, they'll just bring in any behaviours from whatever behaviours that they're used to performing, most of which are about in a project environment, I'm afraid that you're not going to deliver to me what I want. So I'm going to tell you this is what I want in whatever way that I can. What we want to be able to do is say, well, these behaviours are acceptable. Here is the context and framework for those behaviours being acceptable. And particularly within a Scrum environment, I find as soon as you promise one thing, promise it up front, here's what we can commit to, and then you deliver it 2 weeks or 4 weeks later, they go, oh wow, I don't have to worry that I don't have to tell you everything up front. I get opportunities every single sprint to do that. Importantly, the product owner felt ultimately that because of this framework, he felt supported when he needed intervention. He actually had someone formally to go to say, my production environment isn't ready and we need to deploy in November. You handle that while I look after the scope. But that's just the first step for me when I go through project initiation now. The other thing is in the creation of the backlog. I go through a formal process. I invite the business, the SME, the business owner, any stakeholders. I get the team and I embed them into this activity. Typically it's about 20, 30 people, groups of 5, one team member at least in each of them. We know from knowledge management theory, for example, there's tacit and explicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is the stuff that you can actually document. It's about 5% roughly of the whole knowledge experience. Everything else is about, in the context that you're in, what you experience, your shared memories. So the only way to be able to share an understanding about what your users need, what their requirements are, is to experience it firsthand. So the team and users sit together and I have highly specific focused activities that more or less come from user experience design. Anyone familiar with card sorting? Yeah. No? Okay. So card sorting. The first step in creating the backlog, obviously, is to create it and make it ranked. So we get, in this particular example, this is with our last project, we got the whole scope at whatever level of granularity. We put it all on cards and we gave all of the cards to each a set to the 5 groups and said, I want you to look at this functionality and sort it into one of 6 categories. This comes from Peter Morville, who explains that from a user's perspective, their experience is based on six categories of value. All of them together contribute to the value proposition you're offering. The stuff on the left generally tend to be very pragmatic elements. The stuff on the right tend to be very psychological and personal ones. But if you're going to get the ROI from your system, you want people to love the thing that you give them. So naturally, you must consider value from a very personal psychological perspective, as well as is this going to actually do the task, help them people do things. So you need to consider both, and that's what we do. We say, well, based on all of this functionality, for each piece of functionality, put it in the category that has most meaning to you. We then use a target map. So I said, based on all your functionality, put the stuff you most value in the middle, and then the stuff you value next, there, and there, etc. So we have start to get a continuum of value. With then the last step, getting all of the stuff in the middle, putting it all up on the wall. We had about, in this example, about 20 pieces of functionality that were seemed to be of high value to the participants. So okay, here's 20 Postit Notes. Rank them from 1 to 20. So each person did that. As you can see, lots of Postit Notes as a result. And all we did was get the most common score, the mode, then represented in rank order the value of this functionality. It presented an opportunity overall, so now they understand, oh, we're not talking about must-haves and nice-to-haves. It's a continuum, and it's based on value. Provided us that opportunity to re-norm the environment, set the context, and say that old way of thinking and behaving about, and the way that you then interact with the team, that's no longer the case. This is what we're about. You get to see what's going to be delivered. You've told us the order of your preference that you want this delivered. So you'll get to see this at the end of every sprint. You'll be able, once you see it, you'll be able to give your input into the product owner. He'll take that into consideration. And then you'll get and then the team will then say, okay, this is the next tranche of stuff to commit to, etc.
Matthew, sorry. Is it okay to ask questions if you go on?
Yes.
Just in terms of getting to that point, you're saying no more mandatory and nice to have. But what point in here are you talking about your sort of biblical product setting, feature set?
That's a very good question. I'll deal with that now. Not until the team are at a level of being unconsciously competent about what they're doing. And I'll get to that obviously later. So to users, to people, people will only be able to absorb a certain amount of learning at a time. And so the first step, if you like, is to just to re-norm the environment and do this. But we've got, I mean, within a Scrum, you've got within your ceremonies, they're quite, they build up a cadence, and it provides ongoing opportunities, for me at least, to be able to then start to engage the environment about where people are up to, and then inject new concepts to them, to allow both parties, both users and the team, to come to an understanding of what the ultimate goal is. So I'll get to unconsciously competent a bit later. So that's essentially what I use to communicate to them about what the expectations are, essentially the storming phase. These are the ideas of how the behaviour should work within my Scrum. The last thing that I do within project initiation is to train the team. My last project, I had a couple of guys who had already done a couple of Scrum projects, but regardless, we still went through a day of training. And I do this for a simple reason. It means you get one set of rules to tackle the scope, one goal to tackle a project, one plan to tackle the requirements, one set of requirements, one set of terminology, and that everyone experiences the same thing at the same time. There's no ambiguity about, I wasn't there, so I didn't hear this, and I've got other ideas. Everyone is together and receives the same communication at the same time. In fact, I use a cut-down version of Kane Ma's Scrum certification course. And once we've done it, typically in the first half we do here are the rules. In the afternoon we do learning-based, scenario-based training, which is here is our scenario, and in order for you to enact the rules that you've learnt in the first half, while the scenario sounds fictitious often, it's actually based on a real scenario. And at the end I give them checklists, so that everyone can say, okay, here we were told these were the rules, we experienced the rules, and now here's a reminder of the rules for us to take away. Importantly, they all say, time box. Here is a ceremony. It's got this time box. So daily stand-up, grooming, sprint planning, review, both demo and retrospective, and give to the team. And then I re-hand them out as we start to go into planning the next day. Here is your checklist, and these are the things we're going to get through. Importantly then, as we go into successive sprints, whether it's grooming the backlog with users, or into demo, or into retrospective, again these now become agendas to reinforce that these very clearly, so that everyone has no misunderstandings, these are the behavioural rules that we're going to adhere to. Now I know what some of you are thinking, oh, but my team is great, they don't need training, they're fine. But I'd like to ask you, are they unconsciously competent? Some of you might know these four from management theory. It comes from this guy, Birch, who was a psychologist working at Gordon Training International. There's also some suggestion that these four phases actually go back to Maslow, not in some of his more popular papers, but in some of his minor ones. It essentially says that as you start to learn something, you go through these four. Unconsciously incompetent just means that you're blissfully ignorant. You don't know what you don't know. Managers in particular become very threatened at the consciously incompetent phase, because it's the point where you go, oh dear, I know now that there are all these things that I just have no skills in. And this is why within the storming phase, managers will then try to push that uncertainty away. Australian culture, as Australians, we're very high on uncertainty avoidance. That's why during elections we tend to like to stick with the same guy rather than choose something different. So managers, people who are used to their hierarchy power, will come in and want to press their ideas. You're putting in new ones. Well, those are different. To pass from consciously incompetent to consciously incompetent, you remember the time when you first started to learn to drive? Right? You've got the instructor there and you have to keep all the rules in your head. You're by yourself in the car, thinking manually, okay, change the gear now, I'm listening for the revs in the engine. That's consciously competent. It's when you've got to keep all the rules in your head in order to be able to do well. I'm sure you've all been driving and you start the car and you arrive and you go, wow, how did I get here? Time just passes really quickly. That's when you become unconsciously competent, when the rules are just completely second nature to you. In terms of consciously competent, what I tend to look for in order to try to understand the behaviour of the team, to whether to know what sorts of behaviours are going to impact adversely on my scrum, are simply these. That they obviously know the basic rules, but importantly, do they understand why? Do they understand why the rules apply? Because most of the time this leads to flawed interpretations of those rules. I'll get to that in a sec. Unconsciously competent is that they know the rules, they know why the rules apply, and important, they know what happens when you don't stick to the rules, what the consequences are. A lot of us blissfully go through life, we just do our stuff, and often we don't think about what the consequences of our behaviour actually are. Once you do, this is the stage at where you're at unconsciously competent. And there are some suggestions that there are other phases beyond this. Zen Buddhists like to say that the first step to enlightenment is to acknowledge that you don't know things. And that's often the next step, particularly as a trainer and as a scrum coach, that I always try to achieve, that I'm always looking for and saying, well, what do I not know in order for me to be able to help my team? How many of you have seen this before? I don't need to come to stand-ups. I've seen, strangely enough, a lot of blog posts, probably in the last year, about people talking about stand-ups, and it's like, oh, it's like I'm reporting to mum. Yeah, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing now, and yeah, I don't need any help, thanks mum. But for a lot of people, particularly Scrum Masters, your stand-up isn't just for the team, it's for a lot of other people as well. Yes, it's a good point for a formal point for collaboration, understanding status in the team, but there are other people who need it too. One example, there was my Scrum Master came to me and said, well, one of the team members, who actually used to be a manager of some of the, in other projects, used to be a manager of a couple of other members of the team, more junior, and we get there at stand-up and everyone says, oh, this is what I'm sort of up to, and these things are stopping me from doing. This one guy sort of rattles things off very quickly and then goes to the task board and moves things around. I said, well, look, are you getting what you need as a Scrum Master from the stand-up? Are you able to see what's going on, understand what people are doing, where the solution is going? Do you have clarity about... And he said, no. And this behaviour is about obfuscation, misdirection and renorming. This particular developer, because he was in a position of power, legitimate power previously, essentially wanting to assure that he could continue to have legitimate power, coercive power, and reward power over those developers. And so purposefully was trying to renorm the environment, re-establish his authority over others. And as you know, in a Scrum, there's just the team. That's the only role. So I said, based on the things that the rules that we established the project for, if you don't get clarity as to protect serve, then it's your responsibility. You're responsible for saying, look, that's not appropriate. Go through it slowly, one step at a time, so I can be empowered to serve the project. Which is what he did. The idea about, no, I don't want to come to stand-ups, stand-ups are boring and irrelevant, actually goes further to an underlying problem that team members are not valuing the ceremony. Now, whereas most people just go, oh, we don't need stand-ups, or we don't need retrospective, everything's going fine. I use this, Roti. Anyone using this? Return on time invested. It's a really, really good tool. Simply, at the end of a ceremony, everyone gets a Postit note and they write down their score about what they feel that their invested time was for that ceremony. 4 being, oh wow, that was great, I'm glad I didn't miss it, I learnt a lot, I really felt good about the time that I put into it, I got a lot out of it. 0 is, well, a complete waste of time, I'd rather watch paint dry. 2 is basically the middle. It's about as valuable as if I had been doing, my day job, doing coding, doing testing, doing my UX stuff. And 1 and 3 just being in between. It's not about, though, the score. What's about is continuous improvement inside of the Scrum. Because once they write down their rank, what they also have to do is say what it would take to increase their score by 1 point. What's the one thing that off the top of their head, because this is time boxed at 2 minutes, what's the one thing straight off the top of their head that would improve their investment in time? Mayo came after Taylor. Everyone familiar with Taylorism? He was the guy that said, pay people more and they'll work harder. What he forgot to do was look at the context in which this happened, which was the Great Depression, in which not many people had jobs, everyone was fighting for work. What Mayo found, he was one of the earliest psychologists to come into industrial psychology. So look, it's not actually the fact that you make a change. He went in to an organisation and got a group of people together and said, well, what would it take, what can I change for you to make you more productive in here? And they said, oh, the lights are too bright, can you lower them? Or, things are pretty stark in here, can we have some pot plants? And every time he made a change, productivity increased. He found it didn't matter what it was that he changed, it was the fact that he actually took time in a cadence, quite regularly, listened to people, and then acted on it. That's what made the difference. So it means now what I seek to do that I didn't do before, part of my new recipe for transformation, is to use Roti not as just a point in time, but actually retrospectively. Rather than in a retrospective where you go, so, what worked, what didn't work, what should we keep, what should we not keep, we use Roti instead. And we just say, well, let's look at the timeline of all of the ceremonies. So this is the retrospective from the previous sprint. Here is sprint planning. Here are initial development releases. Here is our early stand-ups. These are some requirements analysis activities sort of took place there as a milestone. Some backlog review, so grooming, second sort of releases of code, later stand-ups, and then demo. And each person gets a range of Postit Notes. They put a little symbol in the corner to identify their sequence, and they use Roti on all of these to rank them from 1 to 4 for each of those activities, for each of those ceremonies. And then the Scrum Master basically gets the sequence and then puts it from left to right. And we can get a really good understanding of what the team feels as a result is their investment in time. So we basically would look at particular dips like this and say, well, what was it about these particular areas that people felt? And you can see that there's sort of a trend here. 3, which is really good, but sort of 2, some things were great. And so, well, what can we collectively do as a team to improve this situation? And so that's what we focus our retrospective on instead. What's the one thing that we can do? Typically we'd then put it on a Post-it note or on a card, and we put it up on the wall. So that was next to the sprint backlog, so everyone could see that these are the behaviours that we want to encourage in order to have a greater amount of enjoyment, a greater amount of return on investment on our ceremonies. I've since evolved this to a Scrum Master health check. And so in retrospective now, after we've done a Roti for all of our ceremonies, we just do a show of 5, so the team go on 3, 1, 2, 3, and show up a hand. So 1 still being crap and 5 being great, on a range of factors. On the left-hand side, ones that are very subjective. On the right-hand side, things that are more objective. So what do they feel that their peak performance is for this particular sprint? Is it trending, therefore, up and down? And this gives a great indicator to the Scrum Master about what behaviour is going on, and importantly, what sorts of behaviours to then reinforce in order to ensure, for example, that peak performance increases. All right, you're only working at a 4. What would it take for you to work at a 5? Still ensuring that sustainable pace is something that we all embrace. What about, how does the team feel about its capability? Does it have the skills necessary to deliver what it needs to? In my last project, they're essentially all developers and testers. They didn't have any UX or really any BA capability. That was probably their biggest weakness. So it was always typically at about sort of a 4. A really, really good team, but when it would come to something that was unknown, they struggled. When it comes to reporting though, so because obviously it's a Prince 2 overarching control environment with Scrum as the execution methodology. Remember in the RACI, it's the product owner's responsibility to inform the project board of what's going on. So essentially we just focus on, this is what we did last sprint, this is what we're doing this sprint, including any risks to the Scrum health that we've identified. And our next sprints, well, certainly based on velocity and a number of other aspects, these are the predicted milestones that we'll achieve. So importantly, nothing about behaviour, nothing about the team, nothing about what they're doing, simply about here is the value that we said we would deliver, we have delivered, this is the stuff we've said we're going to deliver, and based on velocity, here's the stuff that we are likely to deliver. I was talking before about how much, when were the right times to be able to start to introduce new concepts. What I was finding, once I got up to about the second month, the team were consciously competent of the rules, like keeping them all in their head. But we kept on getting a developer going, oh, we need some more upfront design. And so we need to do a spike. We need to do a design spike. And any opportunity we go, we need to do a design spike. We need to do a design spike. The underlying behaviour that was the rationale for this was quite simple. He didn't know enough about the what in order to commit to it. This is when we had to start to talk about, in sort of going into our third month, about minimal viable product. What is, based on what the product owner has said in terms of the what is that minimal description in order to achieve the definition of done? And therefore, how do we then deploy that particular part of the solution? Backlog grooming, I've found, becomes the critical, whereas it's probably the least used and most forgotten ceremony, for me it becomes the most critical. You're supposed to do about 10% of your total time doing analysis of the product backlog and asking that question, what's the minimal viable product in this what? Not interpreting it and then going, oh, well, I could also inject this feature and I could do a little bit more, and because we're really good and smart, we'll do a little bit more. Always saying, well, look, that jeopardizes your social contract with the product owner. You've committed to delivering this. If you go off and start delivering more than what's asked, beyond the minimal viable product, that puts at risk what you've committed to. So rather than, though, doing design spikes and reinforcing that behaviour, instead I've challenged them to move more into doing more grooming of the backlog. Typically I choose to do it a formal point, about a half day in the middle of the sprint, because these guys were working on a monthly sprint cycle, which corresponded to their reporting cycle as well, so the two align quite nicely. Having a break in the middle was kind of a nice opportunity to stop and look at what was coming up, which we also then invited the business to do. And essentially it was an activity to ensure the product backlog was deep. Anyone familiar with that acronym? Detailed, emergent, estimated, and they've changed terminology now. It's now ranked, not prioritised, but still a useful acronym. So detailed enough in terms of what the minimal viable product, the description is. Emergent, well, it's all self-organising based on input and understanding of value as it changes over time. And it all must be ranked. It took my team probably until about the second or third sprint before they were ready to go through a hard slog of about half a day and estimate, at least of what they knew, the entire backlog. Of course, then we understood, based on velocity, that we had functionality of activities about a year. But at least it was estimated. So we knew basically how complex the whole of backlog was. And that then enabled the team to start having much more structured ways to talk about complexity and what this minimal viable product was in many instances. In fact, in one formal backlog grooming session where we had business, and we'd just play planning poker with them. They would have cards and the team would have cards, and we'd read out the product and the definition of done, and the business as well and users and the team would then show up their cards and then have the discussion. And what we found naturally, because the behaviour we were trying to enforce was descriptions about complexity and the minimal viable product, these were the behaviours that were the norms now. The business started, as they were talking about a particular piece of functionality, they'd then stop and go, oh, that's probably about 2 or 3 stories. And then start chunking it down and breaking it down into smaller pieces. Because they knew that was the behavioural norm, but the value to us ultimately was to be able to say, well, which one out of these 3 things, if I was to deliver you it in order, what's the most valuable piece? Of course, the outcomes were essentially that everyone was informed of what was coming up. Everyone got an opportunity to to contribute to the how. Part of behavioural norms was not to talk about solutions. And I'd indulge them sometimes to try to provide greater clarity about the context in which something would be delivered. But this sated their desire to do design up front, and also enabled the product owner to work with the team essentially to prepare for the next sprint. So, conclusions.
Keeping an accurate track of your alcohol intake. Smart idea, considering how much therapy you have here.
That was a perfectly nice guy, and you ruined him. Heard what I did?
Well, I heard who you did.
I screwed up everything. A favorite letter.
It's not what it looks like.
And I hurt Rod.
The broadcast data has shown us the discovery errors of love.
What's wrong with me? You're like two totally different people. Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde.
Don't be so hard on yourself. Do you know the story that happened in the grid?
No.
Russian in the late 1700s, a woman, when she was feeling particularly ready, she used an intricate system of pulleys to have intimate relations with a horse.
I'm sorry, what does this have to do with me?
She engaged in interspecies hanky-panky, and people still call her great. I'm sure your reputation can survive your shaggy old lady boy.
When I reflect on the behaviours that I allowed and that even I did in my early sprints, in my early scrums, I sort of feel a bit like Penny. That, I did them, I didn't really understand the consequences of them, they just happened, and then, mess was everywhere as a result. But look, to be fair, it was essentially because I just accepted the influence of others during the the norming and storming phases. I assumed that flexibility was actually key to Agile, whereas flexibility is actually the outcome, it's not the behaviour. And I did it because I didn't really appreciate the outcomes. I knew I could adapt. I could take on these changes that people were saying that I needed to do, and that I could work through them. But they had consequences. Now, to be successful and importantly repeatable, I know that I need to understand the rules, not just know them. I have to understand how they apply and understand why they won't work if I do something different. Now that I'm consciously competent, I know Scrum is really easy to learn. It's very simple. It's the rule of 3. But it's hard to do well, and it's hard to master. In its simplicity is quite misleading, because it requires you to do specific things, and people then think, well, it's easy, we don't have to do stand-ups, do we? I found the recipe success for a good transformation, therefore, the following. Stick to the rule of 3. Be disciplined about how you do your Scrum. Scrum isn't about pick and choose. A client of mine says it's a bit like learning when a whole bunch of people who speak different languages get together and they all find out that they speak Japanese. Now, you're not going to pick which words of Japanese you're going to choose to talk. You just go, well, we all speak Japanese. Scrum is like that too. You simply do Scrum. Don't forget grooming. I find grooming is probably critical to getting on the front foot of things. I use Roti to drive continuous improvement throughout all of the behaviours. And I spend time doing project initiation up front to ensure that the norming behaviours that I want to establish are established up front, that they're clear, transparent, and everyone knows this is the behaviour that I expect. Don't forget governance, because that helps to reinforce what the new power hierarchy will look like in order to support the referent power and expert power that needs to occur to reinforce collaboration. But I'd say overall to you, don't wait 5 years like I had to come to some of these conclusions. I can now, using this particular learning approach, the psychological learning approach, get a team from consciously incompetent, knowing they suck at the rules, all the way through to unconsciously competent in 3 months. Go and find an expert that will empower you. to do your transformations. That's it. Thank you very much. Now, I've probably gone a bit over time, but I'm here all day if you want to ask me some questions. So, thank you.